Hi there. Thank you, Ben, for that introduction, and thank you to Ms. Ramos for perfectly setting the stage for this panel. Before we jump into it, I would like to introduce our wonderful panelists. Today we have Juha Heikkilä, who is the Advisor for Artificial Intelligence in the European Commission's Directorate-General for Communications, Networks, Content and Technology. Hi, Juha.
Hello.
We also have Cecilia Álvarez, Director of Privacy Policy Engagement at Meta. We have Andreas Hartl, Head of the Artificial Intelligence Division at Germany's Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy. And we have Claude Castelluccia, Commissioner at France's National Commission on Informatics and Liberty. So before we start our panel, just a quick message to our wonderful audience. Please do feel free to use the Q&A tab, and towards the end of our panel, we will get to all of those questions. Okay, so Juha, let's start with you. It's basically been a year since the European Commission released its AI Act. Sort of the discussions so far have mostly focused on social scoring, ethics, biometric readings. Was this to be expected? Do you think the discussions are heading in the right direction?
Thanks very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak at this event. It's a great pleasure for me to give the Commission point of view. So yes, indeed, we did present the package. I should add that the package consists not just of the AI Act, but also of the coordinated plan. Of course, since we are the first ones in the European Commission to present a proposal for a legislative framework, it was kind of expected that it will take a lot of the sort of interest and attention that you'd expect it to get. And in that sense, of course, the discussions that have been going on have been, in my view, understandable and also to some extent expected. But of course, the Commission does much more than that. In that same package that was published in April 21, we of course also published the so-called coordinated plan, which then supports the research and innovation aspect of things. So that's the, if you like, the second pillar that we have, the second leg that we're standing on, because the European Commission is not just a regulatory body, but it is also a funding agency. And if you look at what we've been doing over the past few years, very consistently since the very first AI communication in 2018, we've been in fact emphasizing the need to have a comprehensive approach to AI. So we want to emphasize both the technological and the non-technological aspects of AI. So addressing not just legal and ethical aspects, which we've been doing since 2018, but also the economic and social consequences of AI, but also the research and innovation capacity. And therefore, in the AI package in April, we brought out this coordinated plan, the revised coordinated plan, and with input from the member states. It was first published in December 2018, but it's been now revised to take into account the changing landscape and the changing circumstances. So it has basically the purpose to accelerate investments in AI, to drive resilient economic and social recovery, to act on strategies and programs in the member states, to fully implement them and to take make the most of them, and to align then policy activities in Europe, in the member states and in the Commission. And the policy objectives are basically fourfold. We want to have the right enabling conditions for development, for the development and uptake of AI, because AI can be very beneficial, but you need the uptake for that. And before that technology can be taken up, we also need to have trust for it. So we want to make sure that we have the right conditions, that we have the computing capacity, the data available, etc. But you also want to make sure that Europe has the research and industrial excellence from lab to market. So we support research quite heavily. We have increased our investment in AI quite significantly. So we are spending about 1 billion euros a year on AI in the European Union. And then, of course, we want to make sure, as the third goal, that these technologies work for people. And then, of course, that's where the AI Act steps in. The high-level expert group published their ethics guidelines a few years ago. That's the kind of firing shot, if you like, and that has then inspired the AI Act. And then, of course, we want to ensure that we have strategic leadership in some key sectors like health, mobility, agriculture, but also robotics. So that's, if you like, the other side of the coin, which I think sometimes get perhaps ignored or neglected a bit, although it's a very important part of our overall strategy and package. So that's how we stand. That's how we see the two main pillars of where we are. And of course, then the AI Act has its risk-based approach. So it basically intervenes, if you like, where it's necessary, where we think there is high risk, and there are certain requirements on high-risk systems for AI. Most, we would say about 80-85% is the estimate. Most of the systems that are placed on the market can be placed also in the future, placed on the market in the future the way it's been done so far. They are unaffected. But the high-risk systems, which are basically safety components in already regulated products, plus certain standalone AI systems in, let's say, sensitive areas like management and operation of critical infrastructure, access to private services and benefits, to give you just two examples. So there we think that we need to have then certain requirements. So this risk hierarchy is a key concept here in the AI Act. So it intervenes basically where it's necessary, and then a very small number of systems are considered to be so in conflict with our values that they cannot be accepted. For example, general purpose social scoring. So that's how we approach it, and that's why we think it's important to approach this from both sides. So I hope this kind of clarifies our thinking and our rationale to some extent.
And you were sort of heavily involved in the drafting of all of these documents, and now it's been a year since their release. Has anything surprised you in the sort of general approach to the proposal?
Well, one of the things maybe that has surprised me is that there have been some reactions which have basically stemmed from assumptions of what there is in the AI Act rather than what there really is. So I think that there is this overall feeling, rightly or wrongly, without taking any stand on that, that the European Union tends to regulate and regulate heavily, and that's the purpose. Whereas if you look at the detail, if you look at the proposal as it stands, of course, I should add that that is in the political process by the co-legislators, that is the European Parliament and the Council. So it will change to some extent. But I've noticed that there are perhaps some misconceptions about what is possible, what is not possible. On the other hand, we've also been quite heartened by the feedback we've received. So there are many comments we've received where it is considered to be the right approach. The risk-based approach in particular has been praised as the right way of doing it. Obviously, there's a lot of attention to things like biometric identification. It's a very sensitive issue. That is very understandable. That has obviously become quite a big topic, but not really surprising as such, because I think you can also see it elsewhere in the world. In the US, for example, some states, individual states, have regulated this particular aspect of AI. So I would say that mostly, I think in many ways, the reactions have been expected. Sometimes it is felt on our side that maybe the reactions are based on assumptions rather than actual a closer reading of the text.
Cecilia, can you give us your take on the AI Act? Is this what good AI regulation should look like?
I will start, Millie, to thank you first for organizing this panel and for Rate for having invited us. And now I will answer, of course, the question. I think that we are dependent, as always, on good regulation to develop innovation of the future, and the European Union has an opportunity to provide the incentives, the certainty, and the clarity that is needed for innovators to start or to develop their businesses, as well as for researchers to invest in the next cutting-edge technologies here, through good regulation and mechanisms to keep it updated in collaboration with expert stakeholders, we have the chance in the EU to set the standards that may drive or greatly influence the best practices across the globe. To offset the rise of China's authoritarian-driven AI, democratic societies such as those that we have in the European Union must undertake a joint effort built on democratic norms and values. What do we foresee as good AI regulation? 3 factors seems relevant. One has already been mentioned by Juha with respect to the risk-based approach, harmonization, and the third one, evidence-based. And let me just develop shortly these 3 concepts. With respect to the risk base, we also believe that we need rules that are aimed at controlling the greatest likely threats, as opposed to preventing every theoretical harm, as well as addressing the cost of opportunity, which is also a risk. So to really understand the benefits that the use of AI in the relevant context may provide. This would allow us to collectively ensure that the AI's greater risks are addressed and that we do not lose the benefits enabled by a flourishing innovation in the European Union. The second aspect, the harmonization. We also believe that the AI regulation should be harmonized across jurisdictions, starting with the European Union. Regulation of AI should aim for coherence with internationally consistent standards that are based on widely accepted principles. We believe that this will ensure the clarity and certainty that is needed to attract innovators in the EU from an entrepreneurial viewpoint, but from a research viewpoint as well. And finally, the third element, with respect to the evidence base. In a regulation that is trying to regulate the technology, we believe that it is indispensable that we have a regulatory approach that is evidence-based and take advantage of policy prototyping projects that can provide a safe tasting ground for experimenting with different policies approaches and assessing their impact before they are enacted. There are many things that we do not know, so this is what is about the future, and therefore we need to be able, for responsible innovation, to have this kind of spaces that are safe in order to experiment before this is something that can go to a market, and therefore that will have the relevant impact. And this hopefully will be able to mitigate unintended consequences and ensure that we are moving from principles to practice effectively. And also that in this connection that we are able to assess the evolution, which is something also that is very difficult. I have as a profile, I'm a lawyer, and we have always been saying that the law comes later or comes late as a general rule. We need to also find mechanisms in order that we are able to adapt to what the technology is going to bring us in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cecilia. Andreas, could you give us a sense of your perspective from Germany as a member state? How has the AI Act been received there? What have the discussions focused on?
Millie, thank you first of all for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be part of this panel. Now, let me start with the general remark that I think when we all want to tap the opportunities and put the full potential of artificial intelligence. And what we see is an interdependency of innovation and investment on the one side with trust on the other side. So we appreciate very much the approach from the Commission with the white paper process of combining an ecosystem of innovation with an ecosystem of trust. And as Juha pointed out, there are 2 sides of the coin and both are interlinked. And I hope that we can get into the innovation part, what we're doing to promote the uptake of AI also. But yeah, with pleasure, some remarks from a member state represented in the council and currently involved in the discussions. Maybe just quickly on my position. So I'm with the Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Change, and we're together with the colleagues from the Federal Ministry of Justice in the lead for the AI Act. And we are still examining the full extent of the proposal. We submitted some first drafting suggestions. We have positions on some aspects, but we're still examining the full sorry, I have an audio feedback, but we're still examining it. But what we see is that currently the priorities of the French presidency, and we appreciate this very much, are on the innovation promoting stipulations in Articles 52 through 55, but not neglecting other aspects that are combined with economic aspects. For instance, the new legislative framework, the requirements from market actors, the system of conformity. And what we appreciate very much is that the Commission took the approach of product regulation at its core, and to introduce a system that is well established in the economic realm. But of course, when it comes to standalone artificial intelligence, we see that for those companies active there, it will be a new approach. And we feel at the same time that business models are still evolving. So what we need is a clever combination of regulation and leeway, legroom for innovation. And I think that is the big challenge we see. What we also see is the necessity of thinking about the approach that we need harmonized European norms and standards. So the hinge, in a way, between legislation and norms and standards is also very important for the economy. And I think this is also very important when it comes to AI regulation. And of course, priorities in Germany are also heavily when it comes to biometric recognition. There are still debates in Germany going on. The coalition agreement of the new majority says that biometric recognition should be banned by union law. And we are currently setting up our specific position to the proposal of the Commission. There are many details to be watched, and we need a balance of yes, security and liberty and civil rights there. So, but we see that this is a very important discussion, not only in Europe but also when we look across the the Atlantic. We read with interest a proposal from the White House on an AI Bill of Rights, where we see that they have similar priorities identified for an approach of regulating AI. And I think this is good to see that countries and nations sharing the same values should in a way align their core regulatory approach. I think this is very obvious at the moment that this is of high priority, and we appreciate very much that we now can also discuss this in the TTC discussions of the European Union with the United States administration.
I'm very encouraged and happy that I think innovation is a word that we have heard so far several times. But before we move on to a deeper dive into the innovation aspect, I have a question for Claude. Claude, you are a computer scientist, and so far we've heard a lot about the sort of the regulatory side, trust, evidence-based experimentation, security. So how does all this sound from your perspective?
Yes, thanks a lot, Millie, for the introduction. Yes, as a computer scientist, I think we should really define what we mean by AI and compare it to algorithmic-based system. So in algorithmic-based system, the system is basically designed and coded by some humans, right? So the humans know exactly how the system is working. In AI, basically, there are models that are automatically generated from a bunch of training data. So we have a model, and very often these models are quite opaque. There is this lack of transparency. We don't really know how it works. Usually there are very good performances, but we cannot really explain why. And that can create some questions and concerns, right? Also ethical concerns, like should we deploy systems that work very well, that have good performance, that we cannot understand, we cannot explain. The other things is that as opposed to algorithmic-based system, AI very often are built on personal data. So we have to make sure that the way those systems are built are also compliant to the GDPR. So the risk of AI, I would say, compared to the risk of algorithmic-based systems, is that the data that is used to generate those models can be manipulated, they can be polluted, or just they can be of bad quality. So we have to make sure that the data that we use are of good quality and have not been manipulated. We also have to make sure that they do not contain biases. I mean, I'm sure you all heard about all this discussion about discrimination in AI. And very, very often those biases are due to the data, the training data that contains the data. And there are different sources of biases. It could be the way you collect the data, it could be the way you sample the data, etc. And also the system can, since they are very often built on personal data, they can leak this personal data, which can raise some privacy issue. There are also issues concerned with the model that is generated. The model can be, I would say, easily attacked. And there are new attacks that are published in the community, like these adversarial examples that shows that by just adding a bit of noise in the inputs of the system, you can basically fool the system. You can add backdoors into the system. So we really have to make sure whenever we deploy the systems that they are secure and they are robust. So at the CNIL, which is the French DPA, we've been working on these AI topics for many years because we're handling many projects that use AI in the context of personal data, and that raised many issues and questions like how do you legally constitute a training data set? Can you reuse a data set that was collected for another purpose? How long should you keep the data that is used to build a system? How do you inform users about the data being used to train a AI system? Or how do you implement the user right? So there are many questions, many challenges, and as a matter of fact, we just set up at the CNIL a website for AI designer and developer to help them to be GDPR compliant. Of course, this is work in process, and we will keep updating this website. But I think we need to have like very clear guidelines for developers, not only for I will say legal expert. And we also have some public consultations in order to get feedback about some specific topics, like at the moment we have a public consultation on smart videos. So there are many still challenges in AI system. I think one of the biggest challenges is the evaluation of the AI. How do you evaluate rigorously AI system? How do you evaluate the performance of a system, the error rate, the false positive rate across different populations, because this system might have different performances for different populations, and we have to make sure that we understand these issues, this performance before deployment. How do we evaluate the robustness of the systems, the security? As I said, there are many security concerns with AI, and we have to make sure that we test them before deploying. And the concern about biases, we need to make sure that whenever we deploy a system, that the system do not discriminate and do not have biases. But in order to do that, we need to get data sets. And that's also an issue. We really need to think about how to set up this data set that could be used to evaluate these systems. And the last point will be about the ethical issue in practice. So there have been many reports talking about the ethical issue in AI, but very few practical framework or methodology. And so if we want to help innovation, if we want to help company or startups, we need to make sure that we are actually publishing methodology and even tools that will help this company to make sure that the system that they deploy are ethical and compliant to the different regulations.
Claude, thank you very much for your thoughts. I think you touched upon some very interesting questions to take into consideration, especially development and evaluation, which sort of falls under the cap of what happens before product deployment, which falls into the aspect of innovation. And as we've noticed so far, and as our previous speakers have pointed out, there's always I think the AI Act and the other documents seek to find a balance between regulation and innovation, and to sort of stimulate innovation. One of the models that has been proposed is the sandbox. Juha, could you give us, could you explain to us how the AI Act envisages sandboxes? How are they supposed to work or be used?
So the sandbox is the idea that you can sort of, before something is released on the market, its sort of legal implications can be tested in a protected environment. And of course, this can be very useful and valuable then, in the sense that it enables you to assess what are the kinds of consequences, what are the kind of implications, which are not necessarily immediately obvious. And I should point out that we have also other things in the pipeline which kind of go in this direction. So in the new digital program, which we have launched now, which is a program not focused on research, but more on infrastructure and capacity building and deployment, that also these testing and experimentation facilities that are included in. So these are the kind of large-scale facilities where developers can go and test their systems and their products and their innovation before it's released. This also can be combined with the idea of sandboxes, where testing can be also systems can be tested from this regulatory side. So we think that this is one of the sort of contributing factors to this, and combined then with the sort of approach in the AI Act, this is something that can be quite useful and helpful in bringing things to the market, also taking into account then the legal implications. Maybe also in a response to what Claude said, which I didn't mention before, perhaps a sort of important point to bear in mind is also the fact that the AI Act will be implemented by means of so-called harmonized standards, and those will be developed then to take into account the kinds of key factors that are relevant, and in that regard, some of the aspects that Claude highlighted will be discussed in that context. The Commission is preparing a so-called standardization mandate, so that European and international standardization organizations can then look at that and take the necessary steps to arrive at standards. Maybe an additional interesting element in this regard is the fact that in the Trade and Technology Council discussions with the United States, the European Union is discussing also a couple of work areas which are related. One is precisely sort of to look at the requirements, technical requirements for trustworthy AI. So this includes also kind of, if you like, a common vocabulary on things like bias, robustness, and safety. So technological, technical, and socio-technical aspects. So we are sort of seeking common ground in those discussions to prepare then to prepare the ground for also standardization work. And of course, the point about ethics and how that is important and how it will be taken into practice. I mean, that's another thing that we will be looking at, how to operationalize principles. We have, of course, in the European Union, we have the high-level expert group requirements for trustworthy AI. There was this assessment list for trustworthy AI, which kind of lets companies and organizations to assess to what extent they are in compliance with those key requirements. But there is also need to work more on this. So this is another aspect that we're looking at and to see how we can operationalize this, because obviously it is in many cases, there are also principles that are relatively high level. In those discussions, we have subscribed to the OECD recommendation on AI, which both the US and the European Union have both supported. So in that respect, we have the common ground there, but that is obviously still at a higher level.
Cecilia, in your opinion, are sandboxes the right approach to stimulating innovation? Will they work?
Thank you very much. I think that as many organizations, we are very pleased to see the Commission support for sandboxes, and not only the Commission. I think that the concept per se is a concept that is positive. But it is not only necessary to have a concept, we need also to have a proposal that provides a more holistic experimental governance approach that will inform rulemaking processes and the development of standards and best practices. And I will point out to three elements that I think we need to think about in order for the sandboxes to be successful. One is that we need to have that the resulting law identifies clearly the advantages for the organizations that participate in the sandbox in order to make it clear why organizations should choose to join. The second thing is that although the AI Act is stating that the sandboxes should be a safe space for experimentation, and this is the whole point of this concept, in order for this to be true, we need to provide protections for the organizations that are joining these safe spaces. To be safe, it means that there are protections. It's not only to say it, it's that the protection should be drafted and included also in the regulation. We note that sandboxes do not affect the supervisory powers of competent authorities and that participants remain liable for harm that result from experimentation in the sandbox. Therefore, if this continues to be the case, then there will be little appetite for organizations to go and invest in sandbox, which I think is the desirable outcome. The third element is that it is not only, I think, for the organizations to be able to learn from the experience and experiment, but also for the policymakers in order to feedback into the policy making process. And this is also something that we are not yet seeing in how the sandboxes concept is approached. So this casts significant doubts as to whether the AI can sustain sandboxes that are attractive to organizations for creating and developing new AI systems. And this is for the sandbox, but I believe that we should go a bit further and embrace a concept that is wider, in which sandbox has definitely a very important place in the experimentation and co-creation for the purpose of enabling innovation and improving our regulation as well, which should be something that we need to see as evolving. The same way that technology evolves, the regulation evolves, and we cannot be waiting, I think, for periods of 2 or 3 years in order to get adapted to what the innovation and the future is going to bring to us. So if we embrace this idea of policy prototyping, which is a kind of experimentation-based approach for policy formulation and development that can provide this safe testing ground to try and learn different policy approaches, I think that this may play out when it is implemented in practice. Policy prototyping involves a variety of stakeholders, and therefore is a co-creation actually framework in which you have policymakers, in which you have organizations and other kind of profiles that may bring, let's say, their thinking into how we make that the regulation is actually accompanying the research in a responsible manner and the innovation from an entrepreneurial viewpoint as well, with respect to also testing ethical frameworks, that it has been mentioned by Juha and others, or voluntary standards or certification programs, ethical codes of conduct, best practices, I would say in general, but maybe focusing on specific elements that we believe are particularly important. In this concept of policy prototyping, we have been developing at Meta one of these programs that is inspiring to this idea, which is named Open Loop. in which we look for this multi-stakeholders cooperation, and is complementary to the concept of sandboxes. It aims at informing the public debate with evidence-based reports from the testing of policy frameworks, and in our case, testing the European AI Act. We have already been experimenting with open law with startups in very different countries in Europe with respect to what we call the ADAIA, which is the Automatic Decision Impact Assessment, very much inspired in the GDPR, but focusing on AI in particular. And we plan to run now 3 distinct and intertwined, I would say, open loop programs, each of them taking a specific theme and section of the AI Act. The first one will be the operationalizing the requirements for AI systems. The second, regulatory sandbox, and the third one, the taxonomy of actors, which is quite relevant for the liability regime as well. And these programs will, through a series of workshops and design jams, deploy qualitative and quantitative methods and involve industry partners, European institutions, government entities, regulatory authorities, academics, and other non-governmental organizations. And each of these programs will result in a policy recommendation report. Since I have been the witness already of the experimentation through this open loop program of the ADAIA, I really believe that this is a very good way to do this kind of policy prototyping that we do not yet have in the AI Act recognized as such, and only focusing on a very small part, which is very important, which are the sandbox.
Thank you, Cecilia. It sounds like a very interesting concept, and you pointed out experimentation and co-creation. I think that from the sort of the startup perspective, the innovation aspect seems a little bit confusing, especially the sandbox. So hopefully with redrafts, it'll be a little bit clearer. So I'm wondering, Andreas, listening to everything that is being said, do you think that we have all the ingredients in Europe that we need to stimulate innovation, or are we too focused on the risk aspect?
Well, I think it depends who you ask. We're trying to catch an objective stance as possible. Maybe to highlight some facts from Germany, which I think are very illicit. So we have new numbers for a new report on the digital economy in Germany, and since 1995, more than 6,600 companies linked with AI technologies have been founded. And what's really amazing is that they have a huge survival rate. More than 92% of companies established since 1995 are still economically active. But if you compare 6,000 or 7,000 companies with at least 3.5 million SME companies or business operations in Germany, the numbers are still quite low. And another figure would be that, which is good from the development aspect, that currently the number of companies who use AI exceeded the 10% mark in 2021, and we saw a doubling in comparison of 19 with 21, which I think is very good. But what we see, and I'm now coming back to the sandbox aspect, is almost all AI active companies collaborate with other companies. That's a very important aspect of developing an AI model, of bringing an AI model to the market, is collaboration. So what we see is a collaborative economy, and therefore it's important to have sandboxes as a facilitator of innovation. And the aspect that was mentioned, the idea of having also policy sandboxes, I think it is very promising, but at the same time, I see the challenges for regulators to accept that maybe you're not just executing legislation, but you're in a box where it's not quite clear what you should do. I mean, that's not what regulators are trained to do. But I think it's a clever model we should think about. So sandboxes not only for technology development or testing business models. In an ideal world, we would also have policy or legislation sandboxes, because we see with all those dynamic developments, and it was also mentioned, actually the legislator is always too late, but that's from principle, I think not doable in another way. But it would be a great method to minimize the risk of error from the legislator, which translates into costs, transactional costs and burdens for companies. But I see that is my private opinion on policy sandboxes. Coming back to the former position, we will hopefully submit very soon some suggestions on improving what we see with the sandboxes. And one idea maybe is echoing what Juha said, that the idea of sandboxes is to test and experiment before entry into market. And what I see is that there are across member states discussions if sandboxes are laboratories or if they should take place in real life, which would be also after entry into market. But I think, again, there are some challenges as well as promising aspects to that. And I think we have to see how to balance this out. But I think it's so we already have some sandboxes. So we have highly automated regional trains in Braunschweig. We already have autonomous buses in the city center of a smaller city called Monheim, which is next to Cologne or Düsseldorf. We have medical drones. So we already have sandboxes, but from the business model perspective, it's not really much about the interface with consumers. Well, buses, of course, it's public transportation, but I think what we could maybe be a bit more courageous to really tap the full potential, and I would hope to see that seeing the GDPR as a positive factor, giving trust, how to balance this more with innovation. I think that this is a huge challenge now for regulators and legislators.
Thank you, Andreas. I think those are some very valid points. I'm conscious of our time, and I really want us to talk a bit about the sort of application side of AI. Moving to that topic, Cecilia, I wonder, how do the AI Act and other regulations interplay to assure the responsible application of AI systems, in your opinion?
Thank you very much, Millie. I will focus with respect to other regulations working together with AI, in particular on the GDPR, because this is my area of expertise, and therefore I probably know much better than with respect to other laws. In GDPR, it doesn't work in isolation, and even less as a plugin. If we believe, as we do, that we should be able to implement the privacy by design principle in the technology, we should ensure that we also have a consistent regulatory making process by design as well. I think that as any kind of privacy professional know how painful it is to work with rules that have not been truly taken into account how GDPR works in practice jointly with another regulation. I have been unfortunately witnessing so many regulations saying, without prejudice to the application now of the GDPR and the time of the Data Protection Directive, that has proven that this is not an effective approach. Without making here an exhaustive list, I would like to highlight a certain number of aspects of the GDPR that I believe we need to take into account when addressing the regulation on AI. And not necessarily based on the original Commission proposal, but thinking that this should be in our minds during all the legislative process that is still ongoing. The first one is how we define high risk, and we need to understand that in the GDPR we already have specific rules that have been focusing on when the GDPR was thinking that AI was posing specific risks that we need to pay particular attention. And this was in Article 22, that was touching upon 4 particular aspects of automated decisions that could be assimilated to a certain number of AI processes that are based on AI. First, it was the criteria to define what high risk is. And in this case, the GDPR was focusing on the fact that these kind of decisions were producing legal effects or that similarly affects the individual. And the examples that were provided by the data protection authorities in this respect were very much focusing on the access by individuals to public services, to health, to financial services, to things that are really, let's say, essential, or do we believe as a society that are essential, and that if you have an automated decision, you need to pay more attention on how this automated decision is producing, let's say, this effect that's so important in the life of individuals. The second element was to provide information for individuals. Of course, we take the element of transparency, but the way in which the AI Act speaks about transparency is not necessarily the same angle that the GDPR takes. The GDPR is looking at transparency, looking at the fact that the person knows that there is an automated decision that is happening, an understanding of the logic involved without becoming mathematicians for doing this, and also the consequences for the individual, so that they understand what is this kind of significant legal impact that it has in your life with respect to this context. The third element that we have in this article is that there is particular attention when sensitive categories of data are involved, in order not to prohibit them, but to pay more attention with respect to calling for implementing additional safeguards, because this kind of data requires an additional protection. And the third thing was to ensure human intervention, but in a different manner than the AI Act is looking at. It's a very specific goal, that is to enable individuals not to oppose per se, but to express their point of view, and if applicable, to contest the automated decision, and to bring, let's say, more context, as the case may be, in order to explain why this decision should not necessarily apply in the manner that it was conceived to the individual per se. This is, let's say, for the notion of high risk and how the GDPR has been addressing this through these 4 different angles that are not exactly the same as those treated in the AI Act. The second one that some of the panelists have already touched upon is the question of bias / discrimination. And for this, we need to address that unfair discrimination, which is, by the way, another fundamental right as well under the Charter. The processing of sensitive categories of data is actually relevant. You will not be able to address whether this is discriminatory or not, taking into account the elements that we have in our laws in Europe with respect to that we do not want discrimination for reasons of gender, for reasons of age, for reasons of, we have a certain number of elements. If we do not have the data to test the gender, as the case may be, bias, or to test whatever other discrimination is there, which normally involves sensitive categories of data, and I refer to the sexual orientation, refer to the ethnic or racial origin. So all of these kinds of data are relevant in order to address discrimination. So we need to be able to process this kind of data in a manner that enables us to test as to whether discrimination or bias is actually present in the outcome, or as the case may be, in the data sets that are used for training. The third element is the risk assessment. I mentioned before in the open loop that we're working on creating the ADAIA, or testing the ADAIA with startups, which was the Automated Decision Impact Assessment, which is a kind of application of the GDPR Data Protection Impact Assessment to the specific elements of AI. And the question is that it is, at least it is not easy to see how we ensure that the AI risk assessment that is foreseen in the AI Act is going to work properly with the DPIA. And we need to think that in the organizations, those who are going to run these processes are the same persons. And we cannot be giving them process after process that are actually not necessarily consistent, or they need to do parallel processes when there are so many things that are in common. And these things need to be looked at in order that we have a single process that encompasses our embed, either starting from the AI embedding the GDPR, or the other way around, starting from the GDPR embedded AI. But we cannot have two parallel processes, because this will actually not be operational at all in the organization, and will be a important.
Cecilia, I don't think we can hear you.
Oh, sorry. Is good.
Oh, sorry, it was just brief.
Oh, sorry.
Please, can you just round up your point? We have 4 minutes left. Absolutely. And I just have one more question for everyone.
Very quickly, just the two main points. Research. So I saw that the Slovenian compromise introduced an exemption from research. I think that this exemption would be useless if the AI regulation is not removing the barriers that we have in the GDPR, either because of the letter or the way in which it has been construed. But the fact is that I have been working before Meta in the research in the pharma industry, and I know this subject quite extensively, and we have not been able to address research properly in the GDPR. So this is maybe a good time for doing this in the AI context. And I will leave it here in order to ensure that you have the time to pose the relevant question before we wrap up.
It's so hard. I mean, we could talk about AI in action. I think it could be a 4-hour panel, and we would still have lots of things to discuss. So I just have a final question for everyone, which is, I wonder, we have now a European approach, but what's the best case scenario, 5 or 10 years down the line? Do we expect some kind of a spillover to the wider global community? Is that one of the goals? Can we have a wider global standardization when it comes to AI regulation? Juha, perhaps we can start with you.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. So 5 to 10 years, that's a long time. A week is a long time in politics. 5 to 10 years is a long time in AI, and even shorter time periods are very short. Look, we have to do AI the way that is right for Europeans. That's the way we see it. So that's why we have taken our approach. The second point I want to mention, to stay concise, is that things may not be constant. So a few years ago, let's say 2 years ago, when the white paper was out, people were talking about the EU regulating, and no one else is there. But things may change. The AI Bill of Rights was mentioned as a UA initiative. It's not legislation. Nevertheless, it's, in our view, goes in the same direction as what we've been traveling for some years now. I mentioned myself that at the state level in the US there is regulation, sometimes quite similar or addressing similar aspects as we do. So I would caution against thinking that things are too constant. Certainly we see in our discussions, for example, with the US, that there is a lot of common ground in the values space. So we share values, and that can of course be interpreted differently. The conclusions may be different, but 5 to 10 years from now, we don't know what it's going to look like. Constants are not necessarily there, and we do our things our own way because that's the right way for us to do it in our view.
Claude, you mentioned data deployment. Do you think that we can achieve standardization beyond Europe in order for Europe to actually flourish with AI innovation?
Yeah, I don't think we should consider AI in isolation without considering data and storage like cloud, right? So I hope like in 5 to 10 years from now, I mean, if you look at companies like Meta, Google, and Amazon, they are doing great in AI, not because they are smarter than others. I mean, they are very smart, but they're doing great because they have access to a lot of data. And I hope from that in 5 to 10 years, we will also have companies like Meta that have a lot of data. And we will also have like storage, European storage, like cloud on which we could store our data safely. So what I would like to say, maybe to conclude, is that we should not consider AI in isolation. We should consider the whole thing, which is data and also storage, the cloud, and so on.
Andreas, any final thoughts?
Yes, thank you. And I think it will be challenging to see the European approach of adequacy of other jurisdictions with European standards in discussions with other partners. So, but I think what we see is out of the G7 process, the French-Canadian initiative of the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence is a promising actor to have this process of exchange, of finding commonalities across democratic countries. We see an important role, of course, with the OECD, which will have an umbrella working party for all the AI activities on AI governance being established this month in Paris. And finally, since we have the G7 presidency, we are continuing what the UK previous year started in the G7 track on data free flow with trust. Next week, the digital ministers will meet in Düsseldorf, and I hope they will adopt a ministerial declaration with an action plan on free flow of data with trust, where the aspect of data exchange, as Claude mentioned, will be, I mean, still part of the discussing and negotiating process, but I hope it will be a part of the action plan to spur the exchange on data spaces, for instance, like Gaia-X. But we will also see that the roundtable of G7 data protection authorities and other data regulators will continue. We see promising initiatives like the UN Privacy Enhancing Technology Initiative. So I think these are on international level a very important initiative.
And Cecilia, what about you from your perspective? Can we expect standardization?
I think I was listening very carefully to my three other panelists answering this question. I should say that I agree with all of them. I believe that AI cannot work in isolation. It doesn't work in isolation, and not only with respect to GDPR, that, as you know, is one of my things, but in general, with respect to our Charter of Human Rights and freedoms. And this is something that's why I believe there is a common ground with many other regions, and not only us. Let's say because we share this kind of common norms and values. Even if there are differences in the details, we should be concentrated more in what is common, and there is a lot. And the TTC, for example, with respect to the common ground that Juha was mentioning with the US, is a reality as well with respect to common values that we may work together. And the OECD is definitely one good place for this kind of efforts that you were mentioning. And the other element is also the UK. So despite what has been the tsunami, at least for me emotionally, to think about the Brexit, the fact is that is, as European and sharing our values as we are, and they are also now finding their path. So I think that this is also an interesting jurisdiction to look at with respect to efforts or joint efforts in addressing the ethical, the technological, and the social and economic impact of such a powerful technology. And the last thing that Claude and Andreas were mentioning, the importance of data. Data is definitely a part of the equation. We cannot be thinking about AI without thinking about data. So if we do not have a free flow of data with trust, which is an element that should go together, this is something that we are going to fail with respect to AI. So we cannot think about the two aspects, let's say, working in parallel worlds. They need to work together properly.
Thank you very much. Well, we're out of time, unfortunately, because I think this has been a very insightful and interesting discussion. Unfortunately, we have to close the session. So thank you very much for taking part. And over to you, Ben.